Folks will sometimes lead a conversation about Israel declaring that the situation in Israel is deeply complex. I agree that it is complex. And like many countries, Israel is a complex place. And Israel's complexity, no doubt, is felt deeply by many people. The American Jewish diaspora, of which I am a member, among them. One of my deepest dives into Israel's complexity presented itself in a weekend at Nev Shalom Wahat Salam, a village in Israel where Jews and Palestinians live, work, and coexist together. The weekend I spent there in 2004 was specifically a chance for Jewish American and Jewish Israeli seminary students to engage in dialogue with Palestinian residents of the West Bank, most of whom were Christian, although there were some members of the Muslim community there as well. Most of us did not speak each other's language, so all of this extremely difficult, facilitated group dialogue was done with the help of a translator. After the first day of excruciating, difficult, and painful dialogue, I was totally drained. And I left that room with a real feeling of hopelessness. But something happened later that evening. I was standing outside by myself. It was getting dark. One of the Palestinian gentlemen from my earlier facilitated group discussion must have seen me from a distance, and he began to approach. I couldn't quite make out who was coming because it was getting dark, but then I did realize who it was. This person had been deeply upset during our dialogue, actually screaming. He also only spoke Arabic, a language that I do not know. What's he going to say to me now? I wondered. And once he caught up to me, he smiled. And then he took me by the hand. The complexity, it all disappeared for me in that moment. He walked me by my hand into the neighborhood cafe 30 feet away. He bought me a beer. We left the cafe, and he took me on a 5-minute stroll, still holding my hand, to where his group of Palestinian West Bank resident friends were congregating. When they saw him and then realized that he was bringing me to their little social gathering, all of them cheered. Upon reaching them, they all hugged me, and we ended up hanging out together till way later than I would ever want to admit to my children. We couldn't actually communicate through spoken language, but we still figured out how to hang out and have fun. The next morning, our facilitated dialogue was still very intense. But I was a little less uncomfortable than I had been the night before, the day before. And perhaps my new Palestinian friends were as well. I left that weekend with a little hope in my heart and the feeling that maybe that adjective, complex, that people always use to describe Israel and the conflict, maybe the situation had just become only the tiniest bit less complex.
There are so many lines of connection. We're about to sing Mi Chamocha. We're going to bridge it into a little bit of Hava Nagila, right?
You gave it away.
So, how did Hava Nagila get famous? Harry Belafonte just died. And it was Harry Belafonte who, in the village, some of us were just in the village in the 10th grade, was singing and heard the song, and he recorded it, and he started to make it famous outside of Israel. And he said, I think I'm the most popular American Jew at one point. And then near the end of his life, as sometimes happens, he found out that his grandfather on his father's side was a member of the tribe. Mi chamocha be'elim Adonai. Who is like you, God?
So we have this guest staying in our house for the next few days, and she was talking about where she grew up in the East Coast, and she said that her community had so many Jews in her community that all the public schools were closed for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Anybody here grow up in such a community with just so many Jews? And how many of you grew up in a community with hardly any Jews, with very few, where you were one of the only Jews in your classroom, very few in your school? That's how I grew up, in that kind of community. And I just, day in and day out, I knew the same, 10 Jewish kids, and that was it, until I had the chance as a junior in college. My college boyfriend and I went on our junior semester to Israel, and it was the very first time for both of us ever going to Israel, and today we just call that boyfriend Rabbi Jonathan. I've always just been obsessed with what it's like to be in a majority and what it's like to be different than all the people around me, and I'll tell you, and I don't know if anyone else does this, sometimes I walk on those couple blocks on Clement Street, and if you hit it at the right time, I'm sometimes the only non-Asian person walking on the street, and I just want to feel that feeling of what that feels like to people who live in a minority. And to have grown up like this Jewishly, Israel is just an experience. I mean, the majority in Israel are Jewish. And if it's Purim, everyone's wearing a costume. There are Hamantaschen in every bakery. Christmas is celebrated very quietly, and if it's the week leading up to Christmas, you might not even know because there's such a minority of Christian citizens in Israel. So it's so hard to describe the feeling of this one country among 195 countries where almost everyone around you is Jewish, where Hebrew is the main language that you just hear all over the streets and on the bus, although there's now plenty of Arabic and Amharic, Russian, and English. But it really feels Jewish there, like everyone's in everyone's business, and they always want to know exactly how much money you make at your job. Judaism just manifests itself in every possible way. So first arriving and feeling surrounded by my tribe just felt so powerful, and it actually still does every time I go back. And then that first time, Jonathan and I worked our way through the old city in Jerusalem to get to the holiest site for all the Jewish people. And we came out of the old city to the plaza in front of the Kotel, the Western Wall, and I had not been prepared for it. I wanted it to be just that great holy moment of pilgrimage. But I didn't know when I was 20 years old that there's a divider called a mechitza that divides men from women. And mechitza means chetzi, half and half, and yet the divider was 2/3 was the men's side and 1/3 was the women's side. And so I see this kotel, this mechitza, as a metaphor in Israel that some people don't mind or notice the mechitza. They don't notice the divider. They don't notice that men get more space, but others do. And I think that our job is to love Israel and not blind ourselves to all the forms of inequities, and to raise our voices together with growing numbers of Israelis who want all Jews, Palestinians, women, all minorities to be treated as creations of the divine, which each one of us is. I see the current protests in Israel as a great, remarkable moment in Jewish history, where people are really standing up because they believe in the country, and everyone's got an Israeli flag and waves it proudly and wants democracy. At the end of next week, Jonathan and I are going on a trip to Israel with Mayor London Breed and some other folks from San Francisco that work for the city. And this trip, which is a Haifa, San Francisco sister city trip, is really a love note to Israel and a loving challenge to make room for all of us. So my prayer is that we continue to grow in our love for Israel, even as we open our eyes to all the inequities and dig into our deepest Jewish values to repair those inequities.
Amen. Amen. Gosh, I was there with you as a junior in college. It's amazing. If you think about how amazing it is, I was born 12 years after the creation of the state. And think about that. The state was founded with around 600,000 Jewish Zionists. And they just did a census, and how many people live in Israel today? About 10 million people live there. About 7.8 million Jews. I was in New York with the 10th grade this last week. New York City is no longer the biggest Jewish city in the world. What is? Tel Aviv is now the biggest Jewish city in the world. How amazing that after 2,000 years of wandering, our people homeless experienced the miraculousness. And we get to live in a time of our people's living return in that land. On our first visit, I remember being amazed at the diversity of our people living there. And I was from Upland, California, very few Jews. I thought we all looked like Woody Allen. And there we were, Jews of so many different colors and ethnicities. Jews coming in and made their home there from Yemen, from Syria, from Kazakhstan. The myriad of Hasidic Jews of different Hasidic expressions, as well as all the expressions of Arabs, Christian, Muslim, Druze, Bedouin, all making their home there. I'll never forget the first time I ordered a falafel in the western part of the city in Jerusalem. And there was this brusque woman in her 60s, that kind of Israeli brusqueness or rudeness. I thought, you should be happy I'm buying a falafel from you. I'm giving you money. And she reached out brusquely and put her hand out. And that was the first time I ever saw the numbers from the camp tattooed on somebody's arm. And I understood how important this land is. Then there was that time that I, as a Reformed Jewish guy in my knitted kippah, enthusiastically walking through Mea Shearim. It means 100 gates. It's the Hasidic section. And it's Simchat Torah. And I wandered in. I went through a door by mistake, maybe. And there were all these Hasids dressed in white. They were kind of Satmar Hasidim. And they looked at me askance for a moment. And then they grabbed me and put me in the dance. And I was able to dance with these very different kinds of Jews. And there was that connection of difference but commonality. One time I'm in Tel Aviv airport before the airport got nice. Everybody remember that? Seeing the biggest cockroach of my life. And I'm a chatter. I kibitz with people. And I kibitz with this guy next to me. He says, let me show you something. He opens up his suitcase, his briefcase, and he pulls out this brick-like thing that looks like pieces falling all over the place. And he told me that one day this is going to be a telephone. And I thought, not going to make it in America, dude. And it was one of the forerunners of the iPhone. The nation that we started up has clearly become the start-up nation. And that is amazing that we're privileged to live in this time. And it is the land of our renewal. Every one of your leaders and our rabbis, cantors, educators, we all study in Eretz Yisrael. Our Torahs are fixed by Israelis. There is that back and forth where we bring liberal Judaism back to them and help them rediscover their Judaism, those who were disconnected and need another pathway. But the parsha this week is Kiddushim. Kiddushim to you, it says, you shall be holy. And God's challenge to us is not to be complacent, Just as we stand up for Israel's safety and security, we also have to be vigilant and call upon her to live up to Jewish values. The prophets of old warned our people about corruption when you get power. They called out even then for freedom, for strong courts of justice that are independent, for loving our neighbors as ourselves. And this is the work of this generation of Zionists. This is the work that we get to do and maybe show the world that people who are in conflict can make peace. That's our job, diverse Jews, diverse people living in the land. Well, Rabbi Beth introduced me to a person who's become one of our heroes, Anat Hoffman, who runs the Israel Religious Action Center in the past, and Women at the Wall. And she wrote this prayer for Israel for the high holidays. And so I pray it tonight. My God, in this sacred moment, give us hope for Israel and her future. Renew our wonder at the miracle of the Jewish state. In the name of the pioneers who made the deserts bloom, give us the tools to cultivate a diversity of Jewish expression in Israel. In the name of fallen soldiers, give us courage to stand up to the words and ways of the zealots, those in our own midst and those among our neighbors. In the name of Israeli inventors who have amazed the world with their innovations, help us apply the same ingenuity to finding a path to peace. In the name of all these women and men, grant us the strength to conquer doubt and despair in Israel, replacing doubt with action, replacing despair with tikva. What does it mean, everyone? Hope. With hope. And let us say, Amen.